You're lying in bed, and your phone is on your chest, and you're doing the thing you always do the first week of the month. You're opening the banking app. Not to check your balance, exactly. More to see how much is left after rent cleared. And this month, like last month, like the 6 months before that, the number on the screen feels wrong. Not wrong like someone stole from you. Wrong like the math doesn't track. You make more than you made 3 years ago. You haven't changed apartments. You haven't added a pet or a parking space or a second bedroom. But rent went up again. And when you looked at the building down the street, the one with the pool you always thought was nicer, their prices went up too, by almost the exact same amount. And you thought, well, that's just the market. Maybe it isn't. In December of 2024, the United States Department of Justice filed a federal antitrust lawsuit against a company called RealPage. And what the DOJ alleged in that complaint is something most renters have never heard of, and something that, once you understand how it works, changes the way you hear the phrase market rate rent for the rest of your life. Now, I need to be clear about something before we go any further. The DOJ has alleged this is illegal. The case is in federal court. No judge or jury has issued a final ruling. What I'm going to walk you through is what the government says happened, what the evidence filed in court documents shows, and what tenants across at least 8 states are doing about it right now. I'm not a lawyer. This isn't legal advice. But the math is the math, and you deserve to see it. Here's how this works. RealPage is a Texas-based software company. They make property management tools for large apartment operators, the kind of companies that own hundreds or thousands of units across multiple cities. One of those tools is a revenue management product, an algorithm that tells landlords what to charge for rent. And if it stopped there, fine. Lots of businesses use pricing software. Airlines do it. Hotels do it. A single company using its own data to optimize its own prices is not illegal. But here's where it gets different. According to the DOJ's complaint, RealPage's system doesn't just use one landlord's data. It collects non-public, competitively sensitive information from competing landlords in the same market. Current rents, occupancy rates, lease expiration dates, concession offerings. Data that, if 2 landlords shared it directly over a phone call and then raised their prices in lockstep, would be a textbook violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law that has been on the books since 1890. The DOJ's theory is straightforward. You can't do through an algorithm what you can't do through a handshake. And it's not a small operation. The DOJ complaint says this software influences rent setting for tens of millions of apartment units. ProPublica's investigation in 2022 estimated the number at approximately 16 million. To put that in perspective, the Census Bureau estimates there are around 40 million renter-occupied units in multifamily buildings in the United States. If the 16 million figure is accurate, that's roughly 40% of the market running through one company's algorithm. In some cities, it's higher. In Nashville, one of the markets most prominently featured in the litigation, ProPublica found that over 70% of large, professionally managed apartment complexes were using the software. Let me say that again. In Nashville, 7 out of 10 large apartment buildings were allegedly feeding their private rental data into the same system and receiving pricing recommendations generated from each other's numbers. Now, there's a feature of this algorithm that when I first read about it in the DOJ's complaint, I had to read twice. It's what antitrust scholars call the vacancy tolerance mechanism. In a normal competitive market, when apartments sit empty, landlords lower prices. That's how supply and demand is supposed to work. Empty unit, lower the price, attract a tenant, fill the building. The DOJ alleges that RealPage's algorithm does something different. It calculates that revenue per available unit is maximized when prices stay high, even if some apartments go unrented. The software reportedly tells a landlord, "You will make more money leaving 5% of your units empty at $1,800 a month than filling every unit at $1,650. Think about that. The algorithm says an empty apartment is worth more than you are. But here's the part that makes it an antitrust issue rather than just an aggressive pricing strategy. That calculation only works if your competitors are also keeping their prices high. If the building across the street drops to $1,650, tenants leave your building for theirs and your vacancy doesn't stay at 5%. It climbs to 15%, and the math collapses. The DOJ alleges that's exactly why the shared data matters. Everyone feeds in. Everyone gets the same direction. Everyone keeps prices up, and the vacancy tolerance holds because nobody breaks rank. The complaint goes further. It alleges that RealPage didn't just make recommendations and walk away. According to the filing, RealPage representatives would contact property managers who priced below the algorithm's recommendation and pressure them to comply. Internal company communications cited in the complaint describe a focus on ensuring high compliance rates with pricing recommendations. One internal document reportedly described the software's benefit as enabling landlords to act together on pricing. Let me give you the lived version of this. Let's call them the Garcias. Household income around $68,000 a year, pretty close to the national median. They rent a 2-bedroom in a mid-sized Sunbelt metro. In 2020, their rent was $1,300 a month. Manageable. About 23% of their gross income. By 2024, that same apartment, no renovations, no new amenities, same parking lot with the same pothole, was $1,700 a month. That's a 30% increase. Their income went up maybe 12% in the same period. Their rent now eats about 30% of gross. They are, by the Census Bureau's definition, cost-burdened. And when Mr. Garcia went online to compare prices, the building 2 blocks north, different owner, different management company, was charging $1,695. The complex on the other side of the highway, also a different owner, was at $1,710. All within $15 of each other. He thought, well, that's just what apartments cost now. According to the DOJ, that identical pricing may not have been coincidence. Expert analysis submitted in the federal class action, which was consolidated in the Middle District of Tennessee, found that apartments using RealPage's software in the same metropolitan area raised rents by statistically identical percentages in the same time periods, at rates that diverged from broader market trends. The experts identified markets including Phoenix, Seattle, Atlanta, and Nashville, where pricing patterns among RealPage users were more correlated than would be expected in a competitive market. The Garcia's extra $400 a month is $4,800 a year. If the plaintiff expert's estimate is right that rents were inflated 3 to 7% above competitive levels, the Garcias are paying somewhere between $50 and $120 a month, more than a competitive market would have charged. That's $600 to $1,400 a year. Not a fortune. But across 5 years of a lease, that's $3,000 to $7,000. And that's one household. The median gross rent in the U.S. was $1,369 a month as of the 2023 American Community Survey. A 5% overcharge on that figure is roughly $68 a month, about $822 a year per household. Multiply that across millions of units. The aggregate alleged overcharge runs into billions annually. Now, in fairness, RealPage has denied all of this. The company's position, stated publicly and in legal filings, is that its pricing recommendations are just That. Recommendations. Landlords have full discretion to accept, reject, or modify them. RealPage says compliance rates are not as high as alleged, that landlords routinely deviate, and that the software simply makes the rental market more efficient by giving landlords better data. They also argue, and this is important, that rent increases during 2020 through 2024 were driven by supply and demand fundamentals. Pandemic migration, years of construction underbuilding, historically low vacancy rates. Real forces. Documented forces. And they're not wrong that those forces exist. This is where the honest answer gets uncomfortable, because both things can be true. Supply and demand were tight, and the software may have amplified and coordinated increases on top of that tightness. The expert analysis in the federal case compares RealPage using properties to non-RealPage properties in the same markets, and finds the RealPage users charge more while maintaining lower occupancy. That's the pattern that, if it holds up in court, suggests something beyond supply and demand at work. The courts will sort this out. I'm not going to tell you the outcome, but I want you to understand what's at stake legally, because this case is bigger than rent. The core question before the court is whether an algorithm can serve as the mechanism of an illegal price-fixing conspiracy under Section 1 of the Sherman Act. That question has never been definitively answered by the Supreme Court. Oxford competition law professor Ariel Ezrachi, who literally wrote the book on this, has argued that algorithmic pricing tools can achieve collusion outcomes that would be impossible to sustain without the technology. The DOJ's theory is actually more aggressive than tacit collusion. They're alleging an explicit agreement to share data through a common platform, which maps more cleanly onto traditional antitrust analysis. If the DOJ wins, the implications reach far beyond housing. Every industry that uses algorithmic pricing, fed by competitor data, hotels, airlines, concert tickets, is watching this case. So who is actually doing something about it? If you're a renter right now thinking this all sounds terrible but abstract, here is where it gets concrete. Arizona's Attorney General filed a separate state lawsuit against RealPage in February 2024, focused on the Phoenix Metro. Washington State's Attorney General filed suit the same year, targeting the Seattle market. The District of Columbia's Attorney General sued RealPage and several large property management companies operating in D.C. Colorado passed legislation in 2024 restricting the use of shared competitor data in automated rental pricing tools. Connecticut passed legislation requiring disclosure when algorithmic pricing tools are used and restricting certain data sharing practices. Minnesota introduced similar legislation. As of early 2025, at least 8 states had active investigations or lawsuits, up from 3 at the start of 2024. And something else is happening that may matter as much as any court ruling. Some of the biggest landlords are walking away from the software on their own. Greystar, one of the largest apartment operators in the country, publicly stated it had stopped using RealPage's pricing recommendation feature. They did this before any court found liability. The litigation itself is changing behavior. Tenant advocacy groups in multiple states are pushing for 3 specific things: mandatory disclosure in lease agreements when algorithmic pricing tools are used to set rent, requirements that landlords independently accept or reject recommendations rather than defaulting to the algorithm, and outright bans on sharing competitively sensitive rental data through third-party platforms. If you're hearing all of this for the first time, you are not behind. This is not a story that has been widely told. ProPublica broke the investigation in October of 2022. The federal class action was consolidated in Tennessee. The DOJ filed its case in December of 2024. Attorney General Merrick Garland put it plainly at the press conference. Americans should not have to pay more in rent because a company has found a new way to scheme with landlords. Look, there's a myth that floats around personal finance spaces, and it goes like this. Landlords can charge whatever they want. It's a free market. And that's partially true. In states without rent control, landlords generally have pricing discretion. But antitrust law doesn't care what the product is. The Sherman Act doesn't have an exemption for housing. A landlord can independently decide to raise rent. A group of competing landlords cannot agree to raise rent together, whether that agreement happens in a conference room, over the phone, or through a shared algorithm. The mechanism doesn't change the law. There's another myth. This is just software making the market efficient, like airline pricing. And the difference matters. When an airline uses its own data to optimize its own fares, that's legal. If Delta, United, and American pooled their booking data through a single system that told all three to charge the same fare on the same routes, that would be a different conversation. That is the conversation the DOJ says we are having about RealPage. And then there's the one that gets under my skin. If it were really illegal, it would have been stopped already. Major antitrust cases take years. The investigation into Microsoft took years. The Google cases took years. The AT&T breakup took years. The machinery of antitrust enforcement is slow, not because the law is uncertain, but because the evidentiary burden is heavy and the stakes are enormous. The conduct continuing during litigation is standard. No injunction has been issued. A preliminary injunction would require a separate motion and hearing. The courts are engaged. Whether they move fast enough is a different question. Here is what you probably noticed and couldn't name. You noticed that when you moved apartments, the new place cost almost exactly what the old place would have cost if you'd stayed and absorbed the increase. You noticed that comparison shopping between buildings in the same neighborhood didn't produce the range of prices you expected. You noticed that your rent went up during a year when the building had visible vacancies, units sitting empty with signs in the windows, and you thought, why wouldn't they lower the price and fill those? You noticed. You just didn't have the word for it. If you're currently renting and want to know whether your building uses algorithmic pricing, there is no federal requirement that your landlord disclose that. Yet, Colorado and Connecticut have moved on disclosure requirements. Your state may or may not have similar protections. If you want to know, you can ask your property manager directly whether they use revenue management software to set rents. You might not get a straight answer, but in states with active legislation, the pressure to disclose is growing. If you're a commenter, tell me this. When did you first notice the prices in your market stopped making sense? When was the moment you realized the building with vacancies wasn't lowering rent? I want to hear your number. I want to close with something specific. The average American household spends about a third of its pre-tax income on housing. For renters, it's worse. Census data shows roughly half of U.S. renters are cost-burdened, spending more than 30% of gross income on rent. Between 2019 and 2024, national median asking rents rose approximately 30%. In Sunbelt metros like Phoenix, Austin, Atlanta, and Nashville, increases hit 35 to 50%. And somewhere in the machinery behind those increases, in some of those buildings, an algorithm was pooling competitor data and spitting out coordinated pricing recommendations designed to maximize revenue even at the cost of leaving units empty. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is a federal lawsuit filed by the Department of Justice of the United States, supported by expert analysis, internal company documents, and statistical pattern evidence reviewed by a federal judge who found it plausible enough to let the case proceed. You're not paranoid. The math was off, and now you know why it might have been off. The case is in court. The software as of right now, is still running. The states are moving. The landlords are starting to distance themselves. And the question the court will ultimately answer is one that matters far beyond your lease. Can an algorithm do legally what a phone call cannot? Every time you comparison shop between two apartments and find the same price, the question is whether that's competition or coordination. You can't answer that question for the courts, but you can answer it for yourself. You can ask your property manager. You can check whether your state has pending legislation. You can write your state representative. You can pay attention to the case. And you can stop assuming that identical prices in a supposedly competitive market are just the market working. That's not cynicism. That is math. Subscribe if you want more of this, the stuff nobody else is telling you. I won't sell you anything. I'll just keep running the numbers.